Welcome to the Athlete's Compass podcast, your North Star for mastering endurance training and holistic health. Join us each week as renowned sports scientist and founder of Athletica.ai, Paul Laursen, along with athlete, coach, and sports scientist Marjaana Rakai, and coach and cyclist Paul Warloski, guide you through the maze of often confusing training principles. Make sure your compass is ready. Class is now in session. Hello and welcome to the Athlete's Compass, where we navigate training, fitness, and health for everyday athletes. This week, we are talking about heart rate variability, or HRV. Paul, you gave a talk in January at the Endurance Exchange Conference about HRV. Could you tell us what you talked about?
Yeah, Paul. Hey, thanks so much, and welcome everyone. Great to hear everyone. I was very privileged. I got an invite from the Endurance Exchange team through Trevor Connor of Fast Talk Laboratories. Huge thanks to him. And I was asked to go and speak on this topic because more and more coaches and athletes are wanting to understand, how do we use this tool of heart rate variability to get insight into making decisions around our training? What does it really mean? So, I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but just so everyone's on page, we just briefly review the principles. And the basic principle is that, we have our heart rate. And when I think of heart rate, the first thing I think about is the Wizard of Oz and the Tin Man and that clock that he was hanging down there because he wanted a heart, right? Like he didn't have a heart. So remember the Tin Man with the clock. And so you immediately think that your pulse is like this clock that's tick-tocking. And at first glance, it sort of sounds that way, but it's not. It's actually quite variable. It varies significantly. And that variation, heart rate variability, tells us a lot of insight into your health. And in particular, your response to any training, but not only that, insight into all the other various different stressors that are inputting into your life, from psychosocial relationship issues that are stressing you out, insight into the menstrual cycle that we'll probably talk about in the next podcast, to insight into how hard your training is. And specifically, of course, when you train, that's a big stressor, right? So heart rate variability is a great tool that we know we can use to give a response to the load of training. And regular listeners to the podcast will have heard about training load. Load is another term for stress. And we've talked about this at length with, what things like the performance profile, where you're looking at the fitness and fatigue sort of things. That's great. But as many of us know, any of us can take a blanket plan and we can train to that blanket plan or that blanket session. But two individuals, say me and Paul, we're going to respond completely differently to that same exact training session. And heart rate variability gives us insight into that individual response to training, Paul.
So Andrew Kent, friend of mine, he asked us, what are the practical applications for using HRV for our training?
Yeah, well, I think that the practical insight that you can get is exactly that, is really, how am I individually responding to this training session that Athletica or any program gives you. And that's the first one. But we should actually go even deeper. And this is what I spoke on at the Endurance Exchange Conference. I spoke about really Marco Altini's HRV for training principles that he lays out. So credit to Marco on all of the stuff that I am, rehashing. But basically, there's a few key principles that we need to follow when we try to get practicality out of heart rate variability. And the first one is that you should never react individually to a single measure, right? So say you're using a Whoop or an Oura Ring or HRV for training, or you name, or Garmin, and say you have a low or a high reading. That's interesting insight, but it's not as finite really as insight that you might get from a training session where it's calculating the load. It's interesting, but what we now realize is that you need to take a more of a Google Earth big picture look at this data. And that's the cool thing, is that's what Athletica is doing now, because if you go to your recovery profile on Athletica and you're measuring heart rate variability, you'll actually get this longitudinal mark of your training and your heart rate variability profile going up and down, up and down, up and down. And you're getting what we call this 60-day average, which winds up being like your normal value. So we're taking a lot of data points to find out what's normal for you. We get this normal range. And then we go a little more granular, and we take a 7-day rolling average. And if the 7-day rolling average starts to drift outside of the 60-day rolling average, the long-term one, it's the same principles as the acute versus chronic workload sort of thing, except looking at it in a different way. And then when that 7-day rolling average is either above or below, well, now we should start, I wonder what's going on here. That's sort of, that's something that now we wonder a little bit deeper. Could this relate to something? Is it related to my menstrual cycle? Is it related to getting sick? Is it related to training, adaptation, and enhancement? Am I feeling fitter? Interesting. In the context where it's going higher. Now we're getting, this is the real value of it for coach and athlete.
So you talked about some of the factors that influence HRV: possible menstrual cycle, sickness, other issues. What are some other things? Does too much training start to factor into HRV?
Yeah, it could be a lot of different things. So again, remember that HRV is getting insight. So I should back the truck up a little bit, and we should just remind we've spoken about this in a lot of different podcasts, but we should just be very clear. There's two branches of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic, fight or flight, and then there's the parasympathetic, rest and digest nervous systems. And when we measure heart rate variability, we're looking at a variable that's got a big fancy term. It's called RMSSD. It's the root mean square of successive differences, right? And it's basically looking at the difference of one heartbeat versus the other heartbeat. Right, and that word successive difference, right? So it's like it's literally capturing, well, what's the difference in this heartbeat? What's the difference in this heartbeat? So it's doing that repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. Again, here's where AI kind of comes into it, right? It's getting insight into the differences in those beats. And when there's a lot of difference in those beats, that means the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest system, is working hard. And that typically means, I'm saying typically because it's not always, but typically that is an indicator of your parasympathetic system ramping up and you adapting. So you're probably sleeping really well if you're getting this on a consistent basis, and you're adapting to your training. Conversely, if you're more like the Tin Man with the clock around there and it's tick tock right on the beat, that's typically a sign of either you're exercising or you're stressed, right? Exercise is a stress, but if you're not recovering, then that's, if your thoughts are racing at night, say, for example, your boss is angry with you, your spouse is fighting with you, et cetera, and you think of how wired you feel in these circumstances, right? Like all of us go through these various different things in life. So think about how hyped up that you kind of are, and either in a good way or a bad way, but that's your sympathetic system, your fight or flight system ramped right up. Well, when your sympathetic system ramps up, it depresses the parasympathetic system, and it quiets down, and it's, again, more like that Tin Man clock. So where did I go with this? But basically, that's the we're looking at we're getting insight into the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and these fluctuations are giving us insight into our ability to adapt to stress and the response to exercise, along with everything else around it. What do you think, Marjaana? How am I doing here? What am I missing?
Oh my gosh, you're doing so good.
I'm rambling.
It's a good ramble.
Okay.
As always, we ask our listeners to send us questions, and our friend Cindy has a few of them. So I'm gonna ask you. She's saying if each person's HRV value is unique, or is there a certain number we should be striving for?
That's a great question, and I wondered the same thing. And so many know that I have a couple good friends of the podcast and in the world, and who are experts in this, and gave me all my insight. The first is my PhD student of the past, and that's Dr. Dan Plews. And the other is my my colleague with Hit Science, which is Martin Bescheit, who's really taught me everything. And but again, Martin and I co-supervised Dan Plews' PhD, which was done on many lots of rowers in the New Zealand rowing program. So, and one thing when we were actually measuring these things, again, the best process of doing research is to actually do these on yourself first. So when I was doing my own research on myself to get insight into my own HRV, it was really interesting because I had this really low value, and my mates like Dan Plews and Martin, they had naturally really high values. So I was kind of, and I was like, oh, I thought that high was always best, right? But there are these little nuances and whatnot that that mean ultimately it's not the case. It really needs to be looked at the individual basis. All that matters is what your value really is. There's this phenomenon called the saturation effect, which applies to me, but I'm not gonna go into that. But basically, you could have an individual low value that could be just fine. You could have an individual high value that could be just fine. All that matters at the end of the day is your value and how you're deviating above or below that. And that kind of goes into the diatribe that I applied when I was talking about the 60-day rolling average versus the 7-day rolling average. So that's all that matters to you, Cindy, is what's your 60-day rolling average, and how does your 7-day rolling average, shorter term, apply relative to your longer term value. So I think I answered the question there, Marjaana.
Well, she has another one. Are you ready for it?
Yeah, of course. I love Cindy's questions.
Cindy asks, I've noticed that leading up to a race, my HRV seems to decline, and I get the warning to take it easy. This always stresses me out, wondering if this is common. Can viewing an unfavorable HRV cause more stress, making your HRV worse? Can
you guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm pulling up this slide here from the presentation at Endurance Exchange. And look, this is data from a couple of those rowers. Now, these are rowers that went on to do World Championship events and also at the London Olympics. And this is all published in Dan's lit review for his PhD, published in Sports Medicine there, Training Adaptation and HRV in Elite Endurance Athletes. So here, so Cindy, yes, in the taper, look at the taper, whether it's World Champs or it's the Olympics, in medalists, the gold medalists from the New Zealand Olympic program, and pretty much every other, athlete that we kind of see. We see this exactly what you described, Cindy, where you go into a low HRV in the taper phase. This is a good thing, and you should actually expect it. You should actually get excited about it. And the reason is that you have You've slowed down with your endurance training. You've probably increased a little bit of intensity, as we often do in the taper period, right? Those high intensity sessions, the primers, etc. That Cindy, I know you'll be familiar with as a longtime user of Athletica. These are all these sorts of things. There's a reduction in the parasympathetic input to the nervous system, and this allows for the sympathetic system to rise. So and again, so a lower HRV, and you want this, right? Because now you've made all the endurance adaptations, and you want to drive and perform now. You want that sympathetic system kind of elevated in that phase. So this is always associated with enhanced performance. And again, we see this in Dan Plew's publications of just blog reports and whatnot. We always see that reduction in HRV. Here's Dougal Allen in the Winning Challenge Wanaka. We see again the reduction in HRV on race day, and it's for that exact sort of same reason. In HRV for training, Kyle Buckingham demonstrating this. We see Jan van Berkel, all of his as well as the same sort of thing. So there's a very common experience there for that, Cindy. Great question.
I was listening to the Greg Bennett show. I'm sure, Paul, you're familiar with that.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Tommy Wood was on, and he said something interesting. It was like, I really liked what he said. I'm going to just read it. HRV doesn't tell you how well you're going to perform. It tells you the cost of a given performance is going to be. You can still perform although HRV is tanked, but there's a large cost to that performance. So how you interpret your HRV score matters.
Absolutely.
Right? Like
Absolutely.
If you're an athlete who gets stressed out about the HRV score going down, maybe it's a good idea not to take that on a race day.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. If it's going to stress you out, it's not just park that. Like we don't need that in that. And this kind of comes down to, the individual, it comes down really to the individual, right? And what they are, their philosophies. And again, this is where, coaches like yourselves can assist with these sorts of decisions, right? Right.
Mm-hmm. And same with sleeping. A lot of people get stressed out. They need to wake up 3 a.m. for Ironman start, and then they can't sleep or fall asleep because they are going through the race, and there's nerves. But I always say, like, one bad night of sleep doesn't tank your performance. Just go.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And if you don't mind me just sharing one more slide, I really like this. This is a tweet put out by Alan Cousins. Many will know he's a lot. I highly respect Alan and a lot of the work that he does because he deals with AI. He's a scientist, and then he also deals a lot with HRV. So Alan says in a tweet, this was actually pretty recent, but he says when you're, as a general principle or a general rule, and then this is in the context of your training, your day-to-day training, when your HRV is high, generally, your response to training is high. That is, you get a high return for the work that you put in. Again, in that context of the 7-day rolling average relative to the 60-day rolling average. And again, when your HRV is low, your response to that training can sometimes also be low. So I think Tommy was a little bit alluding to that in what Marjaana sort of just said. But basically, sometimes you can actually be working really, really hard, training your ass off, but you might actually not be getting anything in return. Because when you are, when that HRV is high, it's usually sort of this signal that the system's ready to respond to that training and adapt you.
So how do we look at those day-to-day readings? If we get a yellow or a red reading, do we take that day off? Do we look at the trends? What happens when we're feeling really good and we get a yellow or a red reading?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. that question, Paul, because again, I will revert to the presentation, and this is again some key takeaway points from the presentation. And again, I've stolen Marco Altini's. Now, can you see that, Paul?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah. So and then this goes back to HIT science principles, Athletica principles, coaching principles, context first always, right? So remember that everything is relative. And that, so hopefully we've nailed that the data needs to be analyzed relative to the historical norms. That means the 7-day average needs to be analyzed relative to the 60-day average. Always looking at the big picture first. So Marco says, avoid naive interpretation. Relax about a single value, and that was your question, Paul. If you get a single value that's high or low, interesting, but it's not like we don't change the training necessarily just because of that single day. And Marjaana alluded to that as well. So higher isn't always better, lower isn't always better. We're going to look at that moving 7-day average. And multi-parameter is key. And this is, again, where we believe that the Athletica philosophy and the AI principles, where we're taking lots of sensor data, we're going to be advantaged. So we need to have more data around the big picture context. So let's look at our CEO, Mark's HRV rolling averages over the last year. So let's look and think, everything is relative, and the big picture first. So look at his 7-day, look at his 60-day rolling average. That's the normal range there. And that is his, that's his 60-day rolling average, which is in the orange. And then we also look to his 7-day rolling average. That's the moving blue line as we see it going across. So this is in days, and this is in RMSSD HRV. Okay, so big picture for now. That's some interesting things that are happening on this graph. We see that all of a sudden over here, his HRV tends to rise. Well, it's, and as a coach of Mark, it's interesting to note that Mark made a significant change to his diet right about here and started following a little bit more in line the Athletica training principles. And did that contribute to these notable changes and general rises in his 7-day average relative to his 60-day average? I don't know. I'd like to believe so. But then Mark, of course, goes to Mexico on a vacation. And what happens when we go to Mexico, right? Sometimes you get a little sick. And indeed, Mark did get sick. And we can see that his rolling 7-day average relative to his 60-day rolling average tends to drop down there. And again, with knowing how this works, I kind of think, that's probably what we would expect. So that's how I kind of use individual versus rolling the 7-day rolling averages. And this is all available on your recovery profile for Athletica. So I hope that answers some questions there. Paul?
It does. So Craig Morfitt, another friend of mine, and I'm training his son right now, he asks if there's a connection between HRV and aging athletes. Does that make a difference? Does age affect HRV? And is that something we need to keep in mind when we're analyzing our data?
Yeah, it's a good one. So for all of us, Paul, we're all all aging. We're all getting, but many of the listeners will have heard the differences between your chronological age, right? That's just the number, and your biological age, and that is how, what is really the age, the level of your cells in terms of how good your cells are functioning relative to what, what might be normal from a chronological standpoint on that. And they're different. And we know that when people live healthy lifestyles, and this includes good nutrition, good sleep, controlled stress, exercise, as we all promote, that the biological age is a much lower relative to the just a number. So we never take an absolute number into effect. And people have asked the same about Athletica in terms of the prescription. And this is why, like, we've done interviews with some of the the physiologists of the world record holders in the 70 plus age category. And these guys are doing 2:48 marathons at age 74, and running miles in a ridiculous sub 5-minute miles kind of thing, right? So these are they're just because of the chronological age, we can't actually say that it actually makes that much of a difference, but the biological age surely does. So irrespective, this is looking at your biological age, right? Because it's looking at how you're individually kind of responding. And then this is probably where a coach really kind of can come into play and assist with helping you to determine where, how things are sort of looking at your biological relative to your chronological age, and individualize the training accordingly. Of course, Athletica will be getting better and better at doing these sorts of things, but for now, that's about all I can sort of say on the topic, Paul.
And I guess because HRV is always individual, you can't like compare two people anyways. But if you've been taking HRV for years, then you can maybe see differences. I don't know.
Yes, well, this is for sure, right? So, look at Mark's data there that we just showed. He's got a whole year of data, and that history, that library is going to get longer and longer, and we are going to be able to do those sorts of retrospective analyses later on. Which should be very helpful in making future decisions. So yeah, again, we always have the old adage, measure what matters. Well, HRV is one of those variables that matters. So that's why we measure it.
Several of my athletes are using, the Garmin app with a body battery, and I've convinced several people to start using HRV for training. What are some other reliable and accessible methods for athletes to measure their HRV? Are there devices or apps that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I have to probably stick with Marco Altini, and who's a colleague and is a pioneer in this variable. Again, as I've just said, I've stolen all the info from him, and that's what I presented at an endurance exchange. But so yeah, HRV for training is a great one. Another tool is my colleague Jason Moore at Elite HRV. Similar principles there. These are two apps, and both of these use the camera lens to measure your HRV. And we validated that with ECG as well in our lab in New Zealand. So there is, once you're comfortable taking the measure, it does become reliable and it's valid, and we've demonstrated that. But also we find the nocturnal measures are also very good. So things like the data that I just showed you from Mark, that was that's taken from his Garmin that he wears to sleep every night, and just naturally kind of comes in. So it takes a mid reading, which we call a nocturnal measure of HRV. It takes the average of good readings that it detects across the night. And Marco has also demonstrated that is a valid procedure as well, and probably the most practical, because now you don't even have to do anything. So it might not be as reliable, but it's more practical, and practicality often wins out in these sorts of things, right? All you got to do is wear it. Same with like an Aura ring. So an Aura ring. So the Marco is an advisor on Aura ring. Last I checked. So again, many of his principles are input in there. Now, what you do need to be careful on, again, are any sorts of apps that are looking at a single variable. So I'll just, if you have a device that's looking at a single low variable, that goes against all the principles that we just taught you on this podcast, right? Because a single variable, a single low day, we just told you, is probably irrelevant. You're not getting good help or insight into anything. you need to be looking at the rolling average and relative to the normal range. So that can be a little shocking to some people sometimes because they've been relying on those, but that's yeah, hopefully that's that makes sense there, Paul.
Yeah.
It makes total
It does.
sense.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't want to put any negative twist, because there are a lot of very popular apps out there with big names that tend to do that, but they're doing a disservice. And you know this because many athletes will tell you this too. They're like, hey, my X device just told me that I need to take a rest day, but I feel completely fine, right? So you, Paul and Marjaana, as coaches, what will you say, right? Yeah, we're training today.
Go right.
Right?
yeah, and like it's just the one, measurement point or one tool that you use to decide what you're gonna do. Like you feel always, like you say, Paul, feel always trumps all data. And I've noticed, like, when I'm training well, the HRV kind of starts dipping down as I'm training, and then I realize, okay, well, I might need to take a day a little bit easier when it really dips down, and then I let it come up a little bit. But I have to say, like, rarely do I ever take a day off unless I'm sick, like this weekend.
Yep.
Just because of my HRV is low.
Yeah, it's a tool in the toolbox, and that's it.
Yeah.
And you pair it alongside those feelings that you just described perfectly, in my opinion, Marjaana.
But I've also done the big mistake of ignoring those dips in HRV. Like, my typical range is 8.2 to 8.9, and I was down to 6.
Yeah, so that great.
When I was overtraining.
Sure, and it's consistently down, right?
Yeah, it's just like went down a slope, and I just kept ignoring it. Felt horrible, slept bad, took HRV measurement. Why did I take it? Because I didn't pay attention to it. I don't know, but I was stupid. I was a dumbass. But anyways,
no, that's so, I mean, again, I'm going to just quickly share that window, because that was the very first thing that we, like, when we went on this journey, you have to kind of we're kind of doing this in reverse, but that was the very first thing that we started doing. So Dan and I were measuring, we're just experimenting this. And Martin, our supervisor, he said, why don't you just see if you can get a couple of these elite athletes and see if they'll start taking morning resting HRV for, and they did. We got 2 athletes. We got a control athlete up here, and we've got an elite gal here who was taking morning resting values, right? And here again, you see over time, just what you described, Marjaana, where over time that HRV was falling, and then that coincided with clinically, physician determined functionally overreaching or overtraining, whatever you kind of want to call it, coupled with shingles. Right. So, I mean, like, when that, which completely suggests that your immune system is suppressed, and, the herpes, virus kind of comes out, right, as it does with shingles. So, like, that was just like, this was the moment. And this was, this was published, I think it was like, really early on in, like, 2010 or something like that, this paper. But so we were collecting the data, in 2009. But like, this was like, oh, interesting. That's when we were sort of just pioneering and the sort of thing, but it's exactly what you described. So yeah, 7-day relative to, you've got to pay attention to those signals when it's slowly going down and down and down and down. Then it's, now we've got something here. We've got to make a change in that training.
Yeah, like last week, kids have been sick. We have, like, head cold in the house. I'm training really well, and when you're training really well, you're always kind of like teetering there
that edge.
on the edge. And then I was looking at my 7-day average, and I'm like, okay, it's going down. And sure enough, then I wake up with the sore throat and runny nose.
For sure.
So
it gave you that signal though, didn't it?
Yeah. But it is so hard to know when to stop.
Yeah.
It
really is.
Art. Yeah, that's the art of listening to your body and looking at your life overall. Take that into account when you're doing those training decisions.
So, yeah, I think again, just to lead to that. To lead to this last point, I think, we've been talking about, when your HRV sort of falls, as it did with Marjaana, as it did in many, case studies, etc. What can I do as an athlete or a coach when I'm getting these consistently low readings in my HRV, suggesting something is off? Okay, so first thing that I can do, low intensity zone 2 training. Change up the day, use the workout wizard, move the session, whatever it may be, but change over to more of a zone 2 kind of stimulus. Almost that should be the number one tool in your toolbox, because we consistently see that that is one tool that can help raise HRV. So, if you had a HIIT session planned, change it to a recovery session or an aerobic, L2 session. Okay, that's principle number one. Sleep. Is there anything you could do about your sleep to get a little bit more? That sleep is a huge tool. When we get better sleep and sleeping more soundly, quality and quantity, HRV tends to rise. We remember the cold water immersion talk that we gave. That is another thing that gives a big surplus in HRV is cold water immersion. That's another thing. Do check on your diet. Diet is another one that really goes into HRV. We saw Mark's data before. We know it has a big influence. And here's one we don't often think about, but it's like social connection. A lot of us are, maybe in this space are a little bit introverted, myself, certainly. And we can spend a little bit too much time isolated with our computers, away from people. Get in with, check on your social contacts and whatnot, because that's actually another thing that raises your HRV, is just being around people. It's natural, and it's something that's good for us. So I'll just add those points there as well, Paul.
Here are the things that I've learned this week. That number one, HRV is an emerging training tool that helps us monitor life stress and health, not just your training stress. And if you pair that with how you're feeling, that's a really good tool. Number two, we're looking for HRV trends in adapting to the training stress. As HRV increases, generally that means we're positively adapting to the stress and ready for training. And number three, it's a very individualized response to training session, and there's a recovery profile on Athletica that's going to help us measure that context of your HRV and help us understand how we are ready for training on a longer term basis. So that is all for this week. Thanks for listening, and join us next week for the Athlete's Compass. You can help us by asking your training questions in the comments below, liking and sharing the podcast, and giving us, 5-star reviews, engaging with us on social media. For Marjaana Rakai and Dr. Paul Laursen, I'm Paul Warloski, and this has been the Athlete's Compass podcast. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Athlete's Compass podcast, your guiding light through the complex world of training for your endurance sport. For a deeper dive into the science, listen to our companion podcast, the Training Science Podcast, and check out the AI adaptive training platform, Athletica.ai. Thanks.